Okay, it's time for our panel discussion on the state of zoning reform and what's coming next. And Dr. Nelson gave you a sneak peek at who's on the panel, but please welcome our panelists, Turner Bitton, and they'll be giving you a little more information about themselves. And remember the QR code on your table. So Turner Bitton, Christine Richman, and Dr. Arnab Chakraborty, and the discussion will be moderated by Dr. Nelson. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to start off with a few questions to the panel, and then in about half hour, 40 minutes or so, we'll have audience Q&A, and then I'll wrap up with more questions to the panel as needed. The questions I have, though, are intended to be interactive, so I might just ask one question, and then we turn into a free-for-all for the full, for the full time we have. But who knows how it's going to go. I'm going to ask the other two panelists, Christine and Turner, to have them tell you a little about them, because Arnab did tell you a little bit about who he is. So, Turner?
Thank you. Thanks for having me. So my name is Turner Bitton. I am a resident of the Glendale neighborhood of Salt Lake City. And a year ago, I co-founded an organization called SLC Neighbors for More Neighbors. And this, for me, was the culmination of about 4 years of frustration. So I serve as a community council chair, essentially a neighborhood organization. And in Salt Lake City, we're provided recognition as a neighborhood association to provide early feedback on development proposals, city plans, and different things like that. And so in my time as a community council chair, I've grown pretty frustrated by the tone of conversation around housing. And our organization focuses specifically on Salt Lake City. So what I'll talk about today are mostly things related to Salt Lake City, and many of my examples will be specific to Salt Lake City. But I don't believe that the overall theme of what I have to say is restricted to Salt Lake City. I think from my perspective, one of the most frustrating things about housing policy is that there tends to be a baked-in opposition to anything that you try to do. It doesn't matter if you're trying to build a single-family home or a 300-unit development along the tracks line in Salt Lake City. At the end of the day, we face kind of a unique political problem in that the public meetings that we have come to rely on as kind of the cornerstone of our public engagement processes, in my mind, are fundamentally broken because they're unrepresentative, and because the folks that show up are either folks like myself, who on one hand is not representative of the neighborhood, or folks who show up in opposition to housing. And all of this kind of came together for me in May of 2022. I had COVID at the time, and I was stuck in a hotel in Switzerland, and the city was holding, I was stuck in a hotel room in Switzerland and not enjoying Switzerland. But I was watching, the city had just had a public hearing on, at the time it was the affordable housing overlay, it's now the affordable housing incentives. And this is a very delicately crafted policy meant to increase affordable housing units throughout Salt Lake City by incentivizing the market to provide those and receive some bonuses for doing so. And I'm looking at this, which in my opinion was a very delicately crafted policy trying to really bring in the nuance of incentivizing the market to build affordable housing. And I'm watching this meeting, and on one hand, there's a group there saying that there is just a boatload of bulldozers waiting to come into every neighborhood and just tear it down and build affordable housing. And then on the other hand, you've got a group of folks that are saying, well, this isn't going to do anything, so you need to throw it away because it's not going to have any impact. And so watching that conversation was like watching two different ships kind of sail by each other in the night. And that, for the last 4 years as a community council chair, has felt how every conversation about housing has felt. That it doesn't, at the end of the day, it doesn't matter what you're trying to do. And so we have a political problem. We have to mobilize and organize people to show up, to prove to policymakers that when they make the right decision, that they're going to be rewarded for that by voters. So that is, if you will, the theory of the case for me.
Is the ordinance making a difference?
It has not been passed yet. It's still making its way through.
After 4 years?
2 years now.
Yeah. Oh, only 2 years. Christine?
So I'm Christine Richman. I am a principal with GSBS Architects and Consulting, and I know many of you in the room because I've worked with you either in the same organizations or as a consultant working with your communities to tackle some of these exact questions. I am a consultant that focuses on general plans, station area plans, small area plans, economic development strategies, that all of which have a similar baseline, which is understanding what the opportunities are, what the challenges are, and what a preferred path forward will be for communities as they face these challenges and opportunities. I will say that the people that I work with are genuinely interested in identifying the solutions to a lot of these really thorny problems that we're coming across. But we are within this environment that has been described so eloquently just now, where there are these political pressures and community pressures that start to influence the types of strategies we start to consider. And so having these types of conversations where I think we focus on what cities can do, but also within the context of all the other factors that are influencing the production of attainable housing are important for us to have as a community.
Okay, thank you. In terms of terminology, we're going to go back and forth between affordable housing, attainable housing, housing affordability. They all mean the same thing. Keeping in mind, though, that technically affordable housing is under technical HUD terms, and there's benchmarks for income and rents and prices. So we're not going to go into the weeds of what that really is. So, but all three of these terms kind of mean the same thing: delivering homes at an affordable price to more people. So actually, Arnab covered about 16 of my questions. So, but I want to get to getting into your involvement now. Turner actually gave us quite a spiel here. So maybe with Christine and Arnab, what have you done in terms of trying to advance housing affordability, housing supply, and so forth?
I have to go first? Oh, okay.
Well, yeah, actually, well, go ahead.
But you want Arnab to go?
Arnab, yeah.
Okay. I think, capturing evidence to the extent that we can regarding the impact of some of these decisions and then showing it is important. Jerusalem talked about how some of the changes and the fear-mongering that may happen around those changes don't materialize, and the outcome is a lot different than what people fear to be. And it takes a lot longer, so there is time to plan and absorb and accommodate some of these changes and get perhaps even better outcome is good. And as a researcher and scholar, I'm more on the sort of data collection and evidence building part of it than being out in the field on a day-to-day basis. But I do work in understanding the communication mechanisms, creating sort of the forum that invites folks who may be typically not present in those shouting matches, reaching folks where they are instead of expecting them to show up at an official public meeting time, especially reaching out and involving communities that are traditionally or historically not as involved because of a variety of reasons. I think all of that can help build a coalition that is essential.
Okay, yeah, Christine did mention more or less what you're doing in the field. This is a great panel, actually. Arnab is in the education business. He generates the data, analyzes the data, and presents data in a way that is objective. And so much of our NIMBY stuff is, half-baked. Well, Arnab's able to unbake that half stuff. And of course, Turner is active in the community level, and Christine is actually helping do the community plan. So this is a great panel. I think maybe what we're missing here is a developer, but I actually do development. So where needed, I might actually chime in on some development angles. So Utah has a list of 24 tools in its modern income housing plan or statute. Communities are supposed to choose, I forget, 2 or 3 or 4 of those tools at a minimum to put into their plans, and plans have to be approved, and so on and so forth. And not to have you recall all 24 of those tools, but which of those tools or other tools do you think make the most difference in expanding the supply of housing that's attainable?
So I can't actually recite all 24, although I've read them a gazillion times. I will say that from my perspective, the tools that allow communities and their developer partners to harness the power of the market itself are the most effective, so that you take advantage of what's already embedded structurally in market returns and in the approach to developing housing. Those are the tools that are the most effective in actually moving the needle. And also, this is my personal soapbox, just going to warn everybody, most of you have probably already heard this, which is in addition to creating housing for people at different income levels, we also need to be paying attention to making sure that that housing is occurring in socially supportive communities and neighborhoods, so that as people are in their living environment, they feel connected to the place that they live and the people around them for social reasons.
Right, good,
And some of those tools really help do that.
good. Turner?
So I'm going to point out two things that I think are working really, really well in Salt Lake City and that I think Salt Lake City is doing well. The first is really leveraging our different transit networks, and whether that's through housing transit reinvestment zones or whether just good old-fashioned transit-oriented development. I would point to the North Temple Corridor as an example of an area where this is working really well. Another example would be the Central 9th neighborhood. So if you haven't been to 9th South and West Temple, 2nd West, you need to go there, because this is a very visual example of what zoning reform can do in terms of revitalizing and really crafting a neighborhood identity. So when you sit at Central 9th, you see a mix of a variety of different houses available to folks there. So there are big, tall apartment complexes right there. There are smaller townhomes. There's missing middle, and there's single-family homes. All of that comes together in this really urban core where you feel like you're in a neighborhood that's alive. And you can juxtapose that with how that neighborhood felt maybe 8, 10 years ago, and it's completely different in a way that really revitalized that character. So I would point to those transit investment areas. And the second one I would point to, and this is something that I think every community can do today, which is to loosen barriers to ADUs. So Salt Lake City earlier this year updated its regulations of ADUs, and in the last several months we've seen a significant uptake in the number of applications for ADUs in Salt Lake City at really no cost to the city. So there's no city money going forward for this. It's just about eliminating those barriers, and I think what that illustrates to us is the promise of zoning reform to really unlock our market, which is good at delivering units at a market rate.
And these are external ADUs?
Yes.
Because internal are allowed by right in the
Yes.
state, yeah. I want to give a little sort of analysis of ADUs. I've been in the ADU business as a researcher for a long time. Actually, I helped launch the Salt Lake City's first ADU program in like 2010 or something under Mayor Becker. Thanks. So I mentioned earlier that when a house is built, its household size is usually the largest it'll ever have. Let's say 3 persons, just for argument. But over time, that house would drift downward as children leave and partners leave and so on and so forth. And maybe over time, that average household size goes down to 2, just to pick a number. Well, that means that same house is missing people it used to house. And it means that the public investment in all the water, sewer, everything else is underused. So the idea of the ADU, whether it's internal or external, is to add another unit to that lot or that structure to repopulate that house, to bring it back up to where it used to be, and saving taxpayers a whole boatload of money along the way. That's my spiel anyway. Arnab.
I would first echo the transit reinvestment idea because it sounds like it brings a lot of different objectives together, including increasing the efficiency of existing investments and major investments like transit. And I'm not that familiar with the local context, but it sounds like it's also been successful in meeting multiple goals in terms of creating mixed income and mixed use development. The other sort of thought I had regarding your question, Chris, is, there are policies that are easier to accomplish, but then there are other things that are maybe more important. So in terms of certain policies that promote general housing production, and market is there to support it, communities should pursue it, but I think keeping in mind about the questions for fair housing, displacement, and all of those things, even though they may be harder to pursue, I think are part of the same equation. And I think they need to be taken as two sides of the same coin if the community needs to, get itself ready to have the ability to house all of its future and current residents.
Okay. So I'm going to put the panelists on the spot here and start with Christine. We all know these states I just mentioned, Montana, Oregon, California, there might be some others, that have state preemption, where the states are telling local governments, you shall allow duplexes, fourplexes on single-family lots, and you shall do this and you shall do that. Versus, except for the internal ADUs, except for Utah that says you shall do a plan, but we're leaving it up to you to craft a plan that makes sense locally using these tools and maybe some others that you come up with. Between those two models, state preemption, telling local governments what they have to do, or the Utah approach with a state-local partnership, which will generate more affordable housing units? Christine.
Wow. So it's not, from my perspective, it's not like an either or, because there are a lot of other factors that go into whether or not the housing units are actually produced. But in the case of some of the preemptions that we're seeing and the specific ones that have been up on the screen that we've seen, they will probably create more units initially, but as those immediate opportunities start to, get absorbed into the market, there, you need to have a continuing program that goes on, because we're a growing community, and it's not a one-off. We need to have a policy and a philosophy of providing the opportunity for people to live in attainable housing long term. And so even if we do have a policy that results in a big bump, we have to continue to do that. And I think that takes a partnership between all of the different parties involved in making sure that housing is produced. That's the state, that's the local governments, but that's also the banks. It's also the design community to identify ways to more efficiently and effectively design and produce housing that meets some of these needs. And so rather than getting a quick bump in some units by a preemption, making sure everybody's working together to help make this happen.
Turner?
I hesitate to answer this because I live in a city where preemption has been used and weaponized against us. We've received a state prison and an inland port through the use of state action, and we've seen the negative consequences of that. So I'm very hesitant to provide a ringing endorsement to preemption, but I think what we have seen is a resistance at the local level to doing the right thing. And it's couched under political terms, it's couched under economic terms, but at the end of the day, if we collectively do not address our housing crisis, then it pushes the state to use these really blunt tools to address the issue. And my question would be, or my concern would be that we can pass a preemption, but without enforcement and effective enforcement. And I think you're seeing this play out in California right now, where the state is suing the city. Without that enforcement, the result may not happen without that enforcement mechanism.
Thank you, yeah.
So, I would bring up this idea of tough choices. I tend to see local governments often as rational actors that are disincentivized structurally from doing certain things. And I think those disincentives are fading to some extent when it comes to developing market price housing. So in those spaces, it may be more on the partnership side of the spectrum, but if those disincentives are not going away to host fair share housing, workforce housing, more affordable housing, then I think, just sort of additional standards and additional measures need to be taken, especially if we want to create sort of a fair distribution of costs and burdens and benefits across the region.
Okay, I have a two-part question, another softball. So should we have minimum density zoning, and should we have maximum housing size zoning? Arnab.
That's a very politically challenging question. I mean, it makes me recall the idea behind, just even in theory, abolishing single-family zoning. And when those advocates are talking about abolishing single-family zoning, they're not talking about abolishing single-family housing. They're just talking about abolishing single-family zoning and saying that, yes, if the homeowner can afford it and the developer would supply it, you can continue to have your large single-family housing. We just want to open up the market and see what else could happen in that space. So this idea of maximum size housing, I think, could become a very, very sort of challenging thing. In some communities, though, depending on what other amenities and infrastructure is available, it could be used as a price mechanism. I think there's a lot of things we do to subsidize large housing. You talked about earlier about how a large house pays the same impact fee as a studio, or a large house one could argue doesn't pay a fair share of its social cost. So if there's a way to build that in, so it's not a direct imposition of an idea like maximum size, but a more fair way of pricing it. And the benefit that the local government and other entities are generating from those gets fed into serving better infrastructure, schools, and the society more broadly. I think some of those conversations then open up a little bit more.
That's you.
Yes, to the first question. I think we're facing a situation where entire generations of people are losing hope in their future. I mean, I look at millennials, Gen Z, so I'm 32. I'm the only person in my entire friend group who owns a home. And I think in the next 10 years, I'm probably the only one that will. And without increased density, without the ability to add more units, we are essentially telling folks that this scarcity of supply is what they're going to have to deal with as they graduate college, as they get married, as they try to create a household. And so it may seem a somewhat extreme position, but no more extreme than artificially restricting supply for the past 50 years and expecting people to be able to make it in that market.
So I mentioned earlier, I have an idea for addressing the supply issue. Oh, Christine I didn't mean to get you off the
They
hook.
were jealous that I got out of that question. You see them handing.
So Christine, what would you prefer?
Well, I would just say that one of the concerns I think that we all share, and that I've heard a lot when I work with the communities, is making sure that what the path forward is sustainable, and that we are maximizing the use of our investments that we've already made in all types of infrastructure. And so if we don't establish sort of minimum zoning in order to take advantage of those investments that we as a community have already made, it's not going to be sustainable long term, especially with the projections of population growth and employment growth. We need to be better and more efficient at how we're using land, because it is what it is, and so we need to be more efficient at that. So I would say yes to minimum zonings. That maximum size thing, that's really hard.
Fair enough. So remember back in 1981, we passed the Economic Recovery Tax Act, ERTA, bipartisan support in Congress, and Reagan signed it into law. The idea was to jumpstart real estate development to bring the economy out of recession. And so what are some of the key features? One of the key features was accelerating depreciation. At the time, depreciation was, I think, 40 years or something for residential and non-residential, 40, 50, whatever it was. Accelerated depreciation allowed a property to be depreciated within about 5 years. When you depreciate property, you take that depreciation amount against your taxable income. So it's a short-term tax shelter. Now, you make it up in theory at the end when you sell the property. But in the meantime, it becomes a cash flow shelter. It also allowed, it also did not differentiate, which we do now, I'm getting into the weeds here, between active and passive investors. So back in 1981, if you were a brain surgeon and you wanted to shelter your brain money, you could invest into one of these accelerated depreciation investments and shelter your brain surgeon money. That's changed. In 1986, that changed, so where we have active and passive investors, that brain surgeon can no longer shelter money from depreciation, but the active investor can. And then thirdly, we changed the capital gains rules, lowered them substantially. Well, that worked too well. We overbuilt office and other types of real estate, tanked the savings and loan industry because we oversupplied the market, and the market couldn't generate the cash flow to sustain the investments in those properties. It's like we learned the lesson about what not to do. But there was a lesson, and the lesson was that if you use these sorts of tax tools, you can generate massive amounts of investment. So what if we go back and say, let's do a fine-tuned version of the ERTA and apply it to targeted housing, attainable housing. And what if we then reinstituted the accelerated depreciation, allowed passive investors to go into the market and make these investments, and instead of having, this is getting into the weeds, but right now if you sell your property, you have to pay ordinary tax on the depreciation that you used in the past. What if we said, you don't have to do that, we'll just simply tax the property at the gain, at capital gains tax, not the full recovery tax. So what if we had these three mechanisms? Accelerated depreciation, allowing passive investors to invest, and tweaking the tax policy to make it more advantageous to make more of these investments. And then what if we added one more thing? What if when you sold your project, your investment, and what if you sold it to owner-occupants? That would be when you could actually use the capital gains side of the treatment rather than the recovery of the depreciation. We're going to throw that out. I don't mean to have you all respond to it, but I'm having some people look at this to see if it might have any legs, and if it does, we might get a coalition together in D.C. to see if we can push it forward. So that's my thought for the day.
So I really, sorry, Arnab. I really like your thought for the day, because what it does is it it puts additional incentives. It doesn't, and it recognizes that this is a complex problem. And whatever those details end up being, I think thinking creatively about how we get the type of investment to speed up, sort of how the production of this type of housing would be very helpful.
No, that's kind of what I was also just thinking through to the conclusion that I thought was coming, which was all of these will generate investment in housing and will spur up housing at a faster pace than we would otherwise see. Right, Chris? Am I following? So is there a way to tie that to certain kinds of housing, according to the National Association of Realtor poll that you showed, towards multifamily, smaller lot, higher density, mixed use, mixed income kind of development? Okay.
Turner, any feedback? No. Nope. Yeah. Staying out of this one, that's Spark guy. So I've got another couple questions, and then we'll have the audience chime in. Actually, I was going to ask this. To many of us in this room, zoning reform seems like the logical thing to do to expand supply of attainable housing. Why don't we see more of it? Well, we kind of discussed that, I think. But are there any additional reasons why we don't see more of zoning reform in Utah anyway?
Well, so I think Turner has talked a lot about establishing political will. I think a lot of the professional planners in this room have a baseline understanding of what needs to happen. The process is much more complicated than that. And in conversations, the work that Envision Utah has been doing, the work that sorry, Ted, I can't remember the name of your group. Oh, no, I know the name of your organization, but that Growing Our Future group is Guiding Our Growth. Thank you. The Guiding Our Growth group and some of the survey results that have come out in a little game of charades going on right now. The results of the surveys that have come out, they indicate that there is a growing awareness within the community about some of the things that need to happen, and that needs to turn into political will. And I think that's why we're not seeing as much, because the professional planners in the room, I think they understand what the zoning reform issue needs to be.
Yeah, and I just add on, I talked a little bit about public engagement processes earlier, and I think fundamentally we have a crisis of democracy where we are regularly asking voters and people what they want. And if you look at the Utah Foundation, if you look at the Kim Gardner Institute, we regularly hear from people that housing is their #1 economic concern. They're worried about the price of housing, they're worried about their kids being able to live here. We hear that over and over and over and over again, and yet when the time comes to vote on an issue, we think about the 5 people who are in the front row ready to scream at us. And I think part of the problem, and this is where I think we have to align the political incentives with the incentives of folks that are trying to build housing. We need to shorten the time that it takes from the moment that you apply to the moment that the construction is done. And that's good for our political leaders that are cautious about adding density, because at the end of the day, I think politics is a numbers game. And if it takes us 2 years from the moment that we apply to the moment that those get the certificate of occupancy and people can move in, of course elected leaders are going to be worried about backlash happening. But if we can shorten the timeline between when a project is proposed and when new constituents moved in, then elected officials can have a little bit of breathing room, quite frankly, to make more bold decisions. And I think that aligns with our goal to bring more housing to market as well. That there's a cost to both politically when we delay these processes, and I'm curious from the planners in the room how many of you feel that adding additional time and additional public hearings and additional people saying the same thing 432 times at you, whether that adds value to any of these projects. And I would suspect that the answer would be no. that there has generally not been a development that has been improved by a 300-day timeline as opposed to a 90-day timeline. And the same, I think, would be true for elected leaders, that the quicker that we can bring these projects to bear, get them constructed, get new constituents in, the quicker that political leaders can see that there will be a benefit to them acting quickly and resolving the #1 issue on voters' minds.
So I'm going to pose another idea, and then we'll open up for audience questions. I'm actually fairly impressed with what Montana is trying to do. Montana has a new planning act. Local governments have to prepare a plan. They have to look at future demand, especially for housing, and they have to plan to meet that housing in a way that is reasonable, according to the state. And then they have to zone land at the front end to meet the plan. In other words, zoning has to conform with the plan, and the plan has to generate the housing that you need. We don't do that in Utah, I don't think. In Utah, we can have a plan that says all kinds of wonderful things, but zoning does not have to be in accordance with the plan. Well, way back in 1926, the Hoover Commission on State Planning wrote in accordance with the plan as a key guideline for zoning in accordance with the plan. We haven't quite figured that out yet in Utah, and it's been almost 100 years. Is that a fair statement?
Yes. So in Utah, the zoning designations and the general plan guides zoning decisions, but in practice, we establish the future land use designations, and then when the opportunity for a new development or redevelopment occurs, then a zoning request, a rezone request is processed, and usually accompanied with a finding of whether or not that rezone is consistent with the future land use chapter of the general plan. And so that has been our common practice, and it does add that rezoning time to the development timeline, and it also allows the local jurisdiction to work with the developer to make sure that the proposal is meeting overall needs. So
I just wanted to add that, I see the value and logic of this, but I haven't seen a recent survey of state requirements for connecting zoning with plans. I'm remembering, Stuart Meck's work from the Smart Growth Guidebook, and it showed that the Utah is more of the norm amongst most states than the connection between planning and zoning. And I think we'd be well served if that connection moved further.
Okay, so let's have some audience questions if there are any. I think we have some microphones about ready to move around. Okay.
Yeah, so I'm going to ask one question first and then start passing it around. This is kind of a selfish question because I have the mic. So what educational or training activities have you found are most effective for community leaders and advocates concerning zoning reform to address affordable housing? So events like this, maybe they're not the most effective, so what have you seen are the most effective opportunities for education?
Wow. I'm covering this in a classroom with a captive audience, which is a very different setting than a public meeting. But, I'm thinking of some scenario planning activities. Like folks here have done a lot. And just putting, people together to share their interests with one another and identifying commonalities helps to build bridges. It needs to be much more of a charrette format than a city council seated up top and the public listening and following timeline. I think leveling the playing field in that regard, making it interactive, hands-on activities and just creating time and space for everybody to share their perspectives, openly and without like threat of violence, and all that helps. So yeah, I mean, this goes against this idea of, depletion of democracy that was brought up earlier. But I think, city councils and public meetings historically have provided that forum. We might be able to use some visual tools and some data to further it.
Sorry, I handed you the microphone because whatever. What I was going to say is that, like Arnab mentioned, there should be opportunities for people to interact with the idea of planning as a dynamic exercise. Not that I'm going to plug Urban Land Institute, but I'm going to plug Urban Land Institute. They have a tool called Urban Plan that you can bring to your planning commission. And we all know planning commissioners are volunteers. They have daytime jobs. They jet in for their meetings, and they have done their homework, and they're working really hard. But allowing them to take a step back and think about that whole comprehensive impact of zoning decisions, then they can, as they're running their meetings, starting to educate the people who are attending. There's some tools out there. I think rather than being in a big room like this, being in smaller settings where people are very comfortable interacting and learning about what the complexities of urban planning is a really effective tool. It's very time consuming, though, for those of us who want to make this happen. But there are some tools out there.
So I've actually had experience with community planning academies in several states. And I'll focus on one, Atlanta Regional Commission, Atlanta, Georgia. They had their community planning academy twice a year, 50 people per session, and you're nominated by various public officials, and it's geared for rising, younger politicians, leaders, public leaders, and so forth. It's a 3-day intensive session where you learn about zoning and planning and law and demography and economics and all these things that they need to know about if they're going to be messing with land uses. And now, that was started like 25 years ago. These people are now in charge of the state. And this continues twice a year, 50 people per session every year, year in, year out, and they have transformed the knowledge base of metropolitan Atlanta leadership. So we might consider something like that in the Valley or anywhere in the state for that matter. So I just throw that out as a possibility.
Sorry, me again. I'll keep it quick. I would just echo exactly what you said. Summit County just did a planning lab, their planning department, and they just did their second session this year, and it was awesome. I got to participate in the first one. But my question is something we haven't really talked about yet today is, we live in a state where tourism is such a big part of our economy, and in Summit County, over 60% of our homes are vacant, or short-term rentals now. In Wasatch County nearby, that's really recently now up to 50%. And of course, those have the regional impacts. I'm curious your thoughts on the panel of how big of a role that plays in the housing crisis, and then what sort of, how can reform and policy address that in a state that's very real estate, pro-real estate?
This is a great question. Nationally, there are studies that show, that Airbnbs and short-term rentals have taken away a lot of housing from the rental market, especially. I think you'll see some difference between, areas that are more exclusively catering to tourists, and then areas that historically was not planned that way, but just has seen more tourist activity as these industries have grown. And for example, you'll find tons of folks who come and stay, I would think, in Salt Lake City because of its close proximity to the mountains. And I actually know some people who were staying here like for at least a couple months last season. I am a friend with them. They're here from North Carolina, and they were just here for weeks. And those are otherwise rental properties, which if they were in the market would, at a certain scale, change the economics of the market. So, how to rein them in, how to impose fees that actually sort of captures the social benefit of that in a way that could be funneled back into programs that could address folks displaced by such phenomenon, I think are important. Unfortunately, I couldn't tell you a good example of this off the top of my head, but I think this is managing Airbnbs is a big sort of subset within the planning literature. So later I could direct you to some literature if you're interested.
So I've done some research in this. I've also, been involved, in some of these. Summit County or Park City has a housing mitigation plan or policy. I think I understand this right. So if a development comes in and impacts on the supply of housing needed for workers, that development has to mitigate its impact by putting up money to build replacement or new housing units. That same concept is used around the Mountain West states in ski resorts. Jackson Hole, Wyoming comes to mind. But these don't address the Airbnb part of the equation. In that respect, I wrote an article for a law journal earlier this year, that posed the idea that you need to license Airbnbs, and then you need to calculate the impact of Airbnbs on housing supply, and then through mitigation, not impact fees, but through mitigation, have the Airbnb owner pay a fee that helps you provide the replaced housing that the Airbnb takes off the market. It's only a theory. I don't know of any place that's done that, but it's out there as a theory. Next question.
In my city, North Salt Lake, the conversation goes something like this, and I think it's common in other communities. I'd love to have you comment on it. It's about parking. It will go something like this. Hey, we'd love to have housing in our walkable town center. We just need to make sure each unit gets 2.5 parking spaces. And so, of course, we know that has an impact on how many units you can put in and the cost of those units. How should we think about parking in this conversation about housing attainability?
Christine? No.
I would like to ask if those comments are coming from residents or developers.
Residents and other counselors and planning commissioners, not from developers. Developers are looking for less.
We have studies. Institute of Transportation Engineers have parking studies, and they're okay. And then you can hire, if you have the money to, you can hire local transportation engineers, and they will come up with an estimate of the actual parking demand. And they're not that expensive to do, as I recall, but it's data. So just generate the data. That's my approach anyway. And oh, by the way, I studied a hotel conversion into apartments in Denver. Now, hotels, of course, have plenty of parking, but the Denver code required 1.5 or 2 stalls per apartment, but in a hotel, that means that you wouldn't have enough parking on the surface of the hotel to convert all of the units into apartments. So the city wisely went back and they changed their zoning ordinance to allow for conversions of hotels, motels into housing. The parking was reduced to 1 per unit, and it made the difference.
So Ted, can I ask you, the 2.5, was there a reason for that? What were they afraid of?
Spillover parking onto adjacent
okay.
streets.
All right. So I will say we're working in an area that was one of the first station areas that started to develop after the Blue Line was first opened, and the city, the jurisdiction had pretty low parking ratios. Under the assumption that people living that close to transit would not need a car, which may be true, except that the services that people need to access in terms of grocery and childcare and activities for families were not available within a walking distance, and were not actually available like at the next stop or whatever. And so I think that conversation about parking needs to be part of a holistic conversation about what's happening in the overall area, and making sure that we're maximizing opportunities for reducing VMTs as a result of, trip chaining and allowing people to park once. And so I know that people are like, don't confuse me with the facts of how people actually ask, I want 2.5 parking stalls. But I think that's the only way to really get them to think about that, is in a complex, sort of neighborhood-based way. No studies, though.
I think it's important that we begin the process of shifting our society away from a car-centric one. And if it doesn't start at the local level, it's never going to happen. And so, in my mind, ending parking mandates is the beginning step, allowing the market to determine the need for parking, and having cities getting serious about enforcing on spillover parking. At the end of the day, the concern about parking isn't that there's not enough places to put vehicles, it's that that parking is going to spill over into other parts of the neighborhood. And I would suspect that being willing to enforce on that can help shift behavior. And the other thing that I would say is we have a transit system in Utah Transit Authority that's proven that it will work with local governments to design 15-minute bus routes. And yes, it means that local government has to come to the table and spend money and advocate for itself, but that in my mind is what the future of land use planning is going to look like. It's going to pair transit investments with increased density, and we're going to shift our society through policy.
Okay, I just want to shift back to the last topic that you talked about right before you opened it up for questions real quick. A lot of times when we're working with communities on updating a general plan or something, there's always the fear of, a lot of change all at once. And, we let them know this is a vision for the future, you can be progressive and things like that. And so I just wonder if you could potentially foresee any unintended consequences with requiring zoning to match a general plan, in that, maybe it could be a less progressive plan to kind of dampen those fears from residents.
When we talked about this earlier today, I told Chris, well, if that happens, we change the way we do general plans.
So I'm actually going to address that. As much as I like the Oregon approach, where you plan for the future and then you allocate land through zoning to meet that, the future is never going to happen. It's going to happen differently. So in the meantime, realities change, and the realities require different approaches. The Oregon approach actually impedes nimbleness to adjust things in near term. So that would be one concern I would have about this sort of connecting zoning and planning so tightly, unless you have a very rigorous update process that can anticipate needs for changes.
Yeah, I think that's a really important caveat. The flexibility of general plans allows signaling and doing things that you may not predict. And tying that in zoning creates a challenge, but if there are ways to sort of navigate that particular issue, I think, I haven't scanned all comprehensive plans or general plans, but my sense is those are the areas where generally the ideas are there. It just doesn't translate into zoning, not the other way around.
All right, everyone. Unfortunately, we only have time for one more question, and I wanted it to be a nice question to end the day. So, after listening to today's talks and your fellow panelists, what is one new key insight you have about zoning reform for housing attainability?
I'll kick it off. I mentioned it earlier. Zoning reform is not state preemption. I never really connected that dot until Arnab sort of planted that seed in my head.
It's your fault. I think that the key takeaway for me from these really, not just today, but also our preparatory conversations, is that this is a complex issue, and it's going to require complex solutions with all of the parties at the table. And I think that the parties at the table it's got to be a very big table. But I think we as a community have shown that we can tackle those. But I think this idea of forcing things isn't conducive to getting a really good comprehensive answer.
Sort of I don't know if it's a new insight, but it does reinforce the complexity of this idea. And it makes me think that, us folks who work in this on a daily basis find it complex. Think about how the public would see when they get all these ideas together. So I think having conversations like this, clarify terminology to understand what the interrelationships are, definitely helps build that knowledge and consistency and shared resource so that we can then work together on a very important aspect of our community.
I think for me, the key takeaway is zoning has historically been a tool of exclusion, and I think it will forever maintain that power because it adds unnecessary complexity to the way that cities grow and develop. And I'm not necessarily saying abolish zoning, but we've talked a lot about education and public involvement and getting people involved in this process, and we've created, in my opinion, overly complex system for regulating the way that our cities grow. And that inherently is going to lead to exclusionary outcomes. And so I think my takeaway from all of this is that we, as kind of keepers of knowledge within this complex system, that we have to both be explainers and that we have to be willing to challenge orthodoxy and the things that we just kind of accept as a fact. That if we don't draw these little arbitrary lines on a map, that our cities will not develop in some organic way. And I think that is disproven by our experience as a species. We've built cities long before we had zoning as a conception, and I think it's important for us to remember that this is a snapshot of a moment in time, and that zoning, if it remains complex and it's not used as a tool for social inclusion, that the outcome is inherently going to be exclusionary.
And on that note, thank you all very much.
I was going to add, since Jerusalem is here, if we could invite her thought on that note as well.
Jerusalem, would you like to come forward and just, the question was, what one learning have you had about zoning reform today? Yeah, exactly. And thinking that this has been a great panel, great discussion, and as soon as Jerusalem concludes, I will turn it over to Dina Blaze for some closing remarks.
Yeah, I think all three of you had a takeaway that I was thinking about, in particular, this sort of idea about, I think there's a belief, because it is very, very difficult to aggregate all the preferences that exist within a locality when you're doing planning. That means you have to create inherently more and more complex systems instead of at the outset accepting that there's no perfect development and no perfect plan. And thus, there's always going to be trade-offs, and that one hidden trade-off is speed. And especially when you're in a housing crisis, speed becomes much more important. So I think that's my big takeaway today. But thank you all.
Thank you. You guys can stay up here. This is just some quick remarks. Jerusalem, you just added the 24th use of the term complexity today. And I think that's really sort of the watchword that we need to take away from this experience, which is, you know, we focused on zoning reform as part of our dialogue today, but that doesn't take into account so much of what's been discussed here today. Land costs, construction costs, skilled labor shortage, financing costs, and the fact that incomes have not risen at the same pace that housing costs have over the past decade. So this is one of many things, and I think it also underscores our need to embrace complexity and no longer decide that a quick soundbite is going to get us through the day. It's not going to get us through a council meeting. It's not going to get us through a planning commission meeting. And I think those of you in the room, we have an obligation, in my opinion, to do two things. One is to support courageous planning commission members and elected officials, to show up at those meetings, like Jerusalem talked about at the very beginning of this program, that we have to show up and have our voices heard, especially when we come across courageous elected officials that are willing to say the right things and do the right things and take those things into consideration. The other thing that I think is important here is we have to understand that, again, preemption is not zoning reform. I appreciate that very salient comment. And it also means that preemption can almost feel like a cudgel, like we're being bludgeoned with it. And again, complexity comes into play. How it's used and the partnership between state and the local communities is critical. So again, thank you all so much for your time and your expertise today. And thank you all for your time and attention in what is clearly a complex and necessary conversation. So have a great afternoon, and on behalf of Salt Lake County, we thank you very much.
It's toasty.